Hello, and welcome back to the Author Roundup, a special segment of the Book Connection Show where we meet up and coming indie authors and talk to them about their recently released books. Hello, and welcome back to the Author Roundup, a special segment of the Book Connection Show. This is Ray Walters. Our guest for this episode is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor Emeritus at North Carolina State University, where he taught for 43 years. The author of 14 books and over 350 articles and reports, our guest is a frequent contributor to both the local and national media. His comments have appeared on all major networks and in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal. He has also received several prominent awards, including the UNC Board of Governors Award for Excellence in Public Service and the Order of the Long-Leaf Pine from North Carolina's governor. Viewers and listeners, our special guest for today's episode, Mike Walden. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Congratulations. You've just published the fourth installment of your series of books, and this one is entitled Tax Turmoil. This was in April this year, right?
And that was, yes.
Okay. Now, Mike, before we talk about the book that you have published, I am quite sure that our viewers and listeners would also like to get to know you a bit. So you've had 43 years as an educator at North Carolina University, a professor emeritus. So tell us a little bit about this experience.
Well, it was a great experience. I value every one of the years that I taught. In fact, I was probably going to go for 50 years because I had a relative great aunt who taught for 50 years, but then COVID got in the way, made me reassess my life. I moved into my 70s age-wise. So we stopped at 43 years, but North Carolina State University was very good to me. Did all the facets. North Carolina State is what's called a land-grant university. So faculty are expected not only to teach in the classroom and do research, but actually get out in the public. I've been in every county of North Carolina. I've done thousands of talks. Retired, I still do that. It's very enjoyable. So I've been blessed to have a fabulous career.
Mike, writing pretty much has been a part of your profession. As I've said earlier, you've published 14 books and over 350 articles and reports. So can you tell us a little bit about these works?
Well, most of them are nonfiction works. I've written textbooks. I've written compilation books, compilations of other writers where I've been the editor. So that's expected when you're a faculty member. I guess what I did differently was to be drawn to fiction writing also. The motivation for that came about 20 or 25 years ago. When my wife and I were driving to Virginia to visit her relatives. And she was actually also a teacher, elementary school. We often talk shop. And one of the comments I made to her is, I'm disappointed with how the students react to textbooks that are assigned, whether they're my textbooks or others. And I said, I sort of get it because economics textbooks can be extremely dry and boring, quite frankly. And we chatted, and she said, well, maybe what you ought to try to do something different. Maybe you can find a way to communicate economics in an entertaining way where the student wants to read the book because they find it interesting, but at the same time, they are learning economics. So that was the start of our series. We call them Dia Fenner economic thrillers. Dia Fenner is our character that goes through all four of the current books. We hope to have more. Each of our four books addresses a different part of economics, but we weave the economics in a very sort of non-threatening way. I mean, it's not plopped there in the front of the student, but the main character uses economic logic to solve situations that she's gotten herself into. There's no blood that's spilled, but she had some very thrilling situations that she's been placed in. And each of the four books deals with a different part of economics. The latest one, Tax Turmoil, has to do with public policy, taxes, spending. The first one, Macro Mayhem, talks about the macroeconomy. That has to do with things like inflation, the Federal Reserve. Micro Mischief talks about, number two, talks about business decision making. And then Fiscal Fiasco, which was number 3, talks about the investment world. So we got some other parts of economics that, particularly international economics, that we haven't talked about in any of the books. So we may take Dia to a foreign country in books to come along.
I see. And Mike, this is a series, right?
Yes, yes. And although each book is independent, what makes it a series is they're all what we call economic thrillers, and a lot of people react to that and say you can't put those two terms together. Thrilling and economics is boring, and of course that's exactly what we're trying to overcome. And we have the same main character in all of 4. Now she does her life does change. She moves around, and in the latest book that was just published, Tax Turmoil, she's now married, has a child. So you see the evolution of Dia's life, but she's the thread that holds all 4 books together.
So Dia Fenner, the main character of this book, how relatable is she to people like myself?
Well, we think she's very relatable. She's a young person. In book number one, she's dating. She's trying to get acclimated to her new job, which happens to be in the book number 1 with the Federal Reserve. The backdrop of book 1 is Washington, D.C., which is a city that a lot of young people find very attractive. Then we do move her along, and her life does change, but she's a typical young woman in the early books where she has a social life as well as a professional life, and we think that is relatable. Now, in this last book, she's settled down, she's married, has a child, and so we think that young people, especially who are trying to educate themselves about economics, but as well as older people who just want to read, hopefully, a book that they find interesting, but they learn something. So we hope that this character does span the age ranges.
And what makes the book interesting, at the very least for me, it's because it's meant to educate people about economics, but it's done in such an entertaining way. And in my case, while you were talking a while back, I was already sort of like thinking about what this book is. And then I'm kind of like now very much interested to know further and to perhaps even read the book, because you have economics, it's a thriller, it's a love story, and we're following the life of from the time she was dating up until this recent installment of the book where she's now married. And I've looked at the about the book section, and it says there that she has to deal with an ex-boyfriend who has arrived to win her back. So this is really a complete story. I don't know. It feels like it's bringing me already to the edge of my seat.
Well, hopefully. Yeah, in the latest book, Tax Turmoil, she's now in North Carolina. She's the fiscal assistant to the governor of North Carolina. You know, write what you know. And we live in Raleigh. And she does find that an ex-boyfriend shows up. I don't want to give too much away for the plot, but suffice it to say the ex-boyfriend has not lost his attraction to Dia, even though she's married. That develops some complications.
And that's what makes this book really, really interesting, because we'll be able to see how you're going to take us into this journey as we read your book. Mike, so our viewers and listeners, well, I've already mentioned earlier that this book was written to be educational and entertaining, making learning economics fun. This is the 4th installment. Do you feel like you've achieved that goal, making economics educational and entertaining for your readers?
Well, we hope so. We've had friends and others read our books, and they say, wow, that's not anything that we've read like this before that has economics. The education, we hope, sort of just takes place without people thinking about it. It's just because it's woven in the plot. Primarily, she uses her economic ideas to solve whatever situation she's in. So we're showing how economics can be applied in very commonsensical situations. So yeah, it's unlike a textbook where you sit down and, okay, I got to read chapter 1, chapter 2, I got to do these problems. So you know that you're learning about something that hopefully you appreciate, but many people find boring in the case of economics. Whereas here, the education takes place without every people thinking about it. Our goal was to, and when I say my wife actually is listed as a clerk, how we do that, I write the first draft of the book, and she doesn't see anything until I'm totally done. And then I give the draft to her. And she's very good at editing. She's very good at saying, well, this plot twist doesn't quite work. You need to switch that around. So she's on the masthead. She is my co-author. And what we're hoping is that people get so tied up in the story, the thrilling story, that they don't really recognize or think about, oh gosh, I'm understanding some economics here as I'm going along. That's our whole goal.
And I would agree. In my case, I'm not a medical student, but in the course of my life, I've watched several series and read several books that it's a medical drama thriller story. And without me even knowing it, towards the end of reading the book, now I've learned several terminologies and what it meant, like cardiovascular surgery and stuff. And so I'm going to expect the same thing when I'm going to read your book.
Right, you're exactly right. Our books are akin to legal thrillers as well as medical thrillers. Those genres have been out there for a long time. And what we've hoped to have introduced is now the economics thriller.
Right. This is going to be fun. So who's the inspiration behind Dia Fenner?
Well, we were talking before we started taping about how fictional writing is different than non-fictional writing. And one of them is that with non-fictional writing, for example, right now I'm working on a book for University of North Carolina Press about the current North Carolina economy. You sit down, you do the research, you write it up. Fiction writing is totally different. You just can't sit down and look at a screen and start writing. You've got to be inspired and you got to be creative. And where that creation comes from, I don't know. The creative process will hit me at different times a day. I'll have to go hurry and write down the ideas before I lose them. I might be out walking and I'll get a creative thought, plot twist, etc. Or I might be at the gym lifting weights. It's a totally different way of writing. How did I come up with the name Dia Fenner? I don't know. Just popped in my head. Popped in my head. She was born in Chillicothe, Ohio. Now there is a tie there. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. She got educated at her PhD at Cornell. I got my PhD at Cornell. So there are some logical combinations there based on my life. There's some things about my wife's life too, obviously, given the main character is a female. But for the most part, you just have to open that part of that creative part of your brain and let stuff pour in and pour out. It's totally different. Writing fiction is totally different than writing nonfiction.
Or were there days when you felt that you'd have to force yourself to write, or is it something that you'd have to respect? Like if today is not a good day for you to write, you don't do anything about it?
Well, one of my recommendations for people who do want to write is write every day. No, I would write every day. In fact, I still write every day because I'm usually either a fiction book going on or a nonfiction book going on. And you're right that the inspiration can be there in masses on one day and not on another day. But I think on those days where it's not there, it's still good for you to write. Because what I found is once I wouldn't call it a writing block, but if I don't quite know where I'm going, if I sit down at the computer and I bring up the file for the book and I start reading what I've read, oftentimes that will cause those creative juices to start flow. So I'm one who highly recommends to writers or budding writers or future writers to write something every day. I think that's very helpful.
Okay. How many
And
years?
I should say real fast, if you don't like, if you come back and say, I don't like what I wrote, that's fine. That's great. That's in the old days. I mean, I'm old enough to be pre-computer when we wrote something down on a typewriter. You had to go back with whiteout or just tear up the paper. Nice thing about writing on a computer is you can easily make changes. And clearly, when you're writing, whether it's fiction writing or nonfiction writing, you're not going to get it perfect the first time. But I think having something down on paper, even if you know you've got to go back and change it, I think that's valuable.
Right. How long did it take you to finish this?
I probably worked on Tax Turmoil probably 6, 7, 8 months, something like that, just in terms of getting the first draft. I usually I don't write exclusively. I've got other things going. For example, a book I'm working on now about the North Carolina economy. I've got some other things going on. I have a little consulting firm. I do consulting. I've got talks going on that I move around the state. So I'm usually juggling several balls at once, even though I'm retired now, and certainly when I was on the faculty. I don't also have a particular time. There are some writers you read about, writers, primarily famous writers, who will say, well, yeah, I get up at 4 a.m., that's when I write, or at the opposite end, you'll hear some
Right.
writers, I like to write at night. I just wrote when I felt like it, when I got tired of doing some of the other things I'm doing. But I do think it's important to write something every day.
Right. So the entire series, it took you 20 years to
Yeah,
produce.
that's one that's about, I don't know that we ever wrote the date down. It was either 20 or 25 years ago. Again, that trip to Charlottesville, Virginia, where we actually conceived, my wife and I conceived the
Mm.
idea of doing these economic thrillers. Yeah, it was about 20 to 25 years ago. And I don't have a schedule, and I never had a
Right.
schedule in my head that said, okay, I gotta write one of these books every 5 years. Again, it
Mm.
would just come when I was inspired. And I think that's very helpful. I don't think you can really force, again, this is a big difference between nonfiction writing and fiction writing.
Right.
Nonfiction writing, you can sort of force it. Fiction writing, you really can't force it. You've got to be inspired. You've got to have the creative juices flowing. It's totally different experience.
We've come to the part of the interview where I'm going to force you to share to us the the fun part in writing this book. This is a two-part question. What's the fun part in writing this book? And obviously, the opposite of that after, like, what's the challenging part? What made it difficult for you?
Well, actually, the answer is somewhat the same for both. I think the fun part is having an idea and having a concept, which then turns into a plot, and to move that plot along. In our case, I wouldn't call our books mysteries, but there is thrilling aspect that gets solved at the end of the book. The fun part is working on that and then seeing your way to fruition where you've got a conclusion. The bad part of it is the exact same thing, because you've got to come up with a plot that you think is good, but that other people think is good, that they're going to buy the book, that they're not going to pick it up and read and say, "Oh, this is trash." They pick it up and say, "Oh, wow, this is actually interesting." It's actually the same. The good and the bad are sort of mixed together, because it's a constant, I wouldn't say struggle, but it's a constant challenge to move a plot along. I find plotting to be more difficult than developing characters. I think developing characters is easier. Plots are much harder. And with this book, I struggled with, and I think the ending makes sense, but I sort of struggled with, I had the culprit, if you will, and I won't reveal who it is, but it was hard for me to figure out how is that culprit going to be revealed and sort of caught
Right.
red-handed in a way that is not pat, that everyone else has done a zillion times. So finding a creative way to bring the plot to a satisfying conclusion, and the mystery, if you will, the suspenseful part of her life to a satisfying conclusion. I think that was the hardest part with this particular book. With the others, some of the others, it was in a different part of the book.
Right. This is will this be the last installment of the four-part series that you've written?
Hopefully not. I'm not going to do anything right away, but again, you got to be inspired. But
Mhm.
we haven't covered all parts of economics. One part that we haven't covered, which I think would make a nice book number 5, is international economics. There's a whole field in economics devoted to trade between countries and issues like tariffs and subsidizing companies, et cetera. So we have talked about that could be book number 5. I'm not ready to work on that yet, but that's up there in the brain, kind of being tossed around. And at some point, I might wake up and say, "Oh, I've got the basic idea here," and go write it down, and maybe that'll start number 5. So, but yeah, there's more field to be plowed, as farmers say, in this area. We have not certainly exhausted the economic thrillers idea.
Right. And Mike, what's the nicest feedback that you received?
Well, we have a good family friend who is also very creative. She writes fiction, she writes poetry, she writes plays. She's extremely creative and has been successful in that. And probably the best compliment we got was when she read the book. She said, she texted us back and said, "Wow, this is very good. I found it very entertaining." And she's not someone who's just going to make that up. So that was probably the highest compliment we've gotten, just because we respect her and she's so accomplished in the creative area.
Okay. I know you've mentioned a couple of advices for our viewers and listeners, especially for our viewers and listeners that are budding authors. But I'd like to give you a moment actually to offer an advice to these guys, because I know writing is it's challenging, whether it's technical writing or creative writing. It's challenging, and you've said it earlier that, and I would have to agree. If I'm going to write my own story, my own book, I'd probably be able to start it well and make an impact. But what seals the deal basically is the ending of the book. So can you please give us an advice on or what advice you can give us to continue on writing, to pursue our dreams of publishing our book?
Well, if you're writing, I think I said this earlier, and I hope I don't
Yeah.
offend any viewer. Writing nonfiction, I think, is easy compared to fiction, because you got a topic, you do the research, you write it down, etc. Whereas fictional writing, which is what Tax Turmoil is an example of, there's no place to go. It's all got to come out of the head. Now, you got obviously some background, but I think that the things I'd recommend to someone particularly who wants to write fiction is, first of all, write about what you know. Try to, you go out and do research on something. If I was going to write a book about nuclear engineering, I'd certainly have to go out and do a lot of research. So I'm not deterring people from doing that, but hopefully I think it's better to write about something you know, but you've been around. Number two, as I already said, write every day. Write every
Right.
day.
Everything.
You don't have to do it for a certain length of time, but don't. I think when you move away from the writing, it's almost, you come back, it's almost you got to start over, because you want to keep those creative juices flowing. So write every day. And number three, just get stuff down on paper. When the first draft, don't worry about, oh, did I do it this way? Did it wrong? Oh, I need to do a different word. No, get something down on paper, because you can always go back and revise. And it's easy to do with computers. Again, I've done revisions the old-fashioned way before computers, very hard. So write about what you know, write every day, and get stuff down on paper. Don't worry about how it looks, how it reads the first, or even maybe the first three times around. You can always change.
Right. Mike, will you also advise having another set of eyes to go through your manuscript?
Um, Sort of yes and no. The way my wife and I have worked at this out is, I get the first draft and then I let her see it. We talked about, well, maybe you do a chapter and then let her see it. And I think that would interrupt, I think, the creative process flow. So yeah, another pair of eyes is good, but then the question is, when do you bring those eyes in? And my recommendation, at least what has worked for me, I think, is get a first draft of whatever you're doing, and then let your partner, your reviewer, read it, and then, because all you can make changes all you want, but I think you always have to worry about that creative flow.
Those are really valuable advices you've given us, Mike. Let's talk about your personal and professional book goals this year.
Well, my right now, I'm back in the nonfiction world, because I've got a contract at University of North Carolina Press. I'm doing a book on the future North Carolina economy. It's actually the third. I've done three on the North Carolina economy. This one is now taking into account COVID and all the impacts COVID will have on the economy. AI is going to be a big part of this book. So that's probably going to consume me for at least the next year, not first draft and then revisions, et cetera. And then we'll see. Maybe I'll come back to fiction writing, but I don't try to plan too far ahead. I like to have a little bit of freedom with my plans. But I like the experience I've had in, first of all, writing. I love to write, but the fact that I've been able to write nonfiction and fiction, totally different. I don't know that I can do them simultaneously, but totally different, because it's just the way you approach it and the way your brain approaches it is totally different. You got logic on one hand with the
Yeah.
nonfiction, You've got creativity, which sometimes is not logical on the other hand, but I found it's been amazing for me to experience both.
Yeah. So where can we actually get a copy of your book?
Well, all my books are on Amazon. I've got an Amazon author page. So I've got my textbooks, I've got my collected works books, I've got my fiction books. They're all there, and Barnes and Noble too. So yeah, they're out there.
Right. Where can we catch you? Will you be having book signing events?
I don't have any scheduled, but I'm certainly not adverse to people contacting me. My emails, when you're a faculty member, you keep your faculty email for life. So
Right.
I have a very simple email. It's like all faculty at NC State have, and it's my last name, Walden, WALDEN at NCSU. And the difference here, then it's not .com, it's .edu. So
Got
Walden and it's WALDEN at NCSU from North Carolina State University .edu. So happy to look at people's emails, answer questions if I can.
Right. Do you have a website too, Mike?
I'm pretty low tech. I don't do a lot of social media. I mean, at 73 years old, it's probably because I'm at that older range. In some sense, yeah, I miss out on some opportunities, but the other way, I save a lot of time by not spending a lot of time on social media.
Right. Mike, I am very much glad that we had this opportunity to talk about your book, and I hope you enjoyed our short but fun conversation.
I did. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you for gracing the show today and for saying yes to our invitation. And I'd also like to thank all of our viewers and listeners for staying with us all throughout this conversation. Now, before you guys go, show some love by subscribing to our channel and stay tuned for our next interview on the Book Connection Show, where we meet extraordinary indie voices with incredible stories. Again, this is Ray Walters, and join us next time here on the Book Connection Show.